I will now introduce to you Dr. Peter Smith. So Dr. Peter Smith is Emeritus Professor at the Development of Psychology, Goldsmiths University of London, UK. He is author of Understanding School Bullying, Its Nature and Prevention Strategies, and co-editor of School Bullying in the Different Cultures, Eastern and Western Perspectives. In 2015, he was awarded the William Terry Prayer Award for Excellence in Research and Human Development by the European Society for Developmental Psychology. He is currently part of a project comparative study of cyberbullying in Qatar in the UK, risk factors and impact on health and solutions. I now wish to welcome Dr. Peter Smith. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Smith. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the question box. I'll also be monitoring the chat box throughout this presentation. And I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Smith.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm going to talk about cross-national differences in bullying, which is a topic I've been interested in for quite a few years now. It will certainly raise a lot of issues. I'm not sure how many answers I'm going to give, but it will certainly raise questions and things to discuss. So the plan of the talk is here. I'm going to introduce school bullying as an international issue, talk about similarities and differences across countries, then mention some of the cross-national comparisons that have been made. Some of these are quite small scale. I'll start off with a few of them, but then concentrating more on some larger surveys of many countries and with large numbers of participants. I'll talk about measurement issues when we compare countries. Firstly, measurement issues within a survey. One particular survey done in several countries, how do we compare these different countries? But then also comparing different surveys. Do they agree on the country differences they find? And the measurement issues too, then, in comparing different surveys. And then finally, a few slides on how we might try and explain those cross-national differences that we feel are fairly reliable. So school bullying as an international issue. On the right-hand side there is the book that actually was just mentioned by Amber, School Bullying in Different Cultures, Eastern and Western Perspectives, which I edited with colleagues from South Korea and Japan. And that brings together a number of contributions, and I'm going to mention one or two of them in the course of the webinar. On the left-hand side, you see the standard definition of bullying: intent to harm, repeated, and imbalance of power. Intent to harm someone, the actions are repeated, and there's an imbalance of power between the aggressor and the victim. That's the standard sort of way we define bullying in English-speaking countries. Below that, we've got other terms that are reasonably similar to bullying. In the Scandinavian countries, there's mobbing or mobbing, pesten in the Netherlands, chikaneren in Germany, gemeinsein in Austria, ijime in Japan, wangta in South Korea, chifu in Mandarin Chinese, for example. So these different terms are used. Are they the same as bullying, or do they perhaps differ in some fashion? And here's an example of some of the data we have on differences between different countries. This particular one comes from EU Kids Online, which was a survey done in 2010 across 25 countries in the EU. And the bars there, the lighter colored bars, are the rates of being a victim as reported by pupils. And the darker bars below, the smaller ones, are rates of being a cyber victim. EU Kids Online was particularly interested in also in cyber experiences. And along the bottom, you see the initials of the countries. So down on the left-hand end, IT is Italy and PT is Portugal. They're particularly low, according to EU Kids Online. And looking at the right-hand side, we've got Estonia, that's EE, Romania, RO, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, UK, as being perhaps at the higher end of these figures. Remember this Sweden figure here. I'm going to come back to that. Sweden seems to be high in terms of rates of being a victim, according to this study. So what do we make of these differences, the different terms there are for bullying, the different rates, prevalence rates that appear to be in different countries? How well can we compare different countries in this respect? In the book I mentioned earlier, Guillaume and Funder suggests three kinds of approaches to looking at country differences: an absolutist approach, a relativist approach, and a universalist approach. The absolutist approach is to say bullying is the same everywhere, so no problems, we can just compare bullying from one country to another. On the other hand, opposite would be the relativist approach. Bullying is unique to each culture. For example, I once spoke to a colleague from Japan who said ijime is totally different from bullying. You can't really compare the two. It's like apples and oranges. And that kind of approach, if you like, you can see looking at the pictures opposite on the right-hand side. The top picture I got from Google images of bullying, and the bottom picture I got from Google images of ijime. And they're pretty different sorts of images, really. Maybe you can see some similarities, if you like, but also some obvious differences, like the emphasis on physical attack in the top image on bullying, and the emphasis more on social exclusion in the ijime picture on the bottom right.
Can I interrupt you for just 1 second? It appears that what we're seeing is just still your first slide.
Oh, you're
okay,
right now.
There we go. Now we can see it. Yes.
Right. So here we go. Second slide. You can see the second slide. Is it okay? Plan of the talk.
Yes.
Right. And there's the book I mentioned, School Bullying in Different Cultures, and I mentioned the different words for bullying in different languages, the definition of bullying in English-speaking countries. Okay. Then I mentioned the EU Kids Online study. So just to recap briefly, these light-coloured bars show the victimization prevalence generally amongst children, and the darker bars show prevalence of being a cyber victim. And low countries, for example, include Portugal and Italy, and high countries include Sweden, Denmark, Romania, and Estonia. And I said just people remember Sweden here. So we'll come back to that. Then I mentioned the three approaches. This is where I was at: absolutist approach, relativist approach, universalist approach. And the absolutist approach is the bullying is the same everywhere. The relativist approach is it's unique to each culture. You can't really compare. And I pointed out these two images from Google of bullying on the top right and of ijime in Japan on the bottom, sorry, top right and bottom right. And they're pretty different in the way they look. And then the universalist approach would be to say, okay, there are some similarities, but also some differences, sort of in between kind of approach, which might seem obvious, but in practice, many people take the absolutist approach. If you take a questionnaire on bullying, for example, the Obeus questionnaire, which was developed in Scandinavia, and if you just use that in any other country without doing any sort of pilot work on suitability and so on, you're essentially following an absolutist approach. You're just saying things are the same everywhere. You can use the same measuring instrument in any country. So let's look at some of the similarities and differences that we find. And this is my own view, my own take on the research that I've done and read. So I think there are a number of similarities between different countries. And one is just the concept itself, that bullying is an intent to harm someone with repetition and imbalance of power characteristically. And even if some countries don't have a word for bullying, they seem to recognize that concept when it's explained to them. Also, the main types of bullying, that's physical, verbal, social exclusion, relational, cyber, they seem to be present, again, in every country where people have sort of asked about it or looked at it. Beyond that, I think some characteristic age changes are very common across countries too. For example, a fall in victim rates through the adolescent period and into adulthood. And very common gender differences too, with boys being more involved in physical bullying, girls, relative at least, more often involved in relational and cyber types of bullying. And of course, the negative outcomes of being a victim, that's very well established finding in every country where it's been studied. So those are some of the similarities. What about the differences? Well, who bullies who, for example? We'll look at some of these in a moment. Who bullies who? Where does the bullying happen? An important one is the weighting of different types. For example, that picture we saw of ijime suggests social exclusion being important in countries like Japan or South Korea. Related to that, the ratio of bullies to victims. If social exclusion is important, then we may find a larger ratio of bullies to victims in those sorts of Eastern countries than we might do in Western countries. So let's look at one or two bits of evidence about this. This is from a small-scale study carried out with Tomoyuki Kanetsuna quite a few years ago now, where we compared bullying in Japan and England. And Tomoyuki, Japanese, but had studied a number of years in England too, did his PhD with me some years ago now, and was very well prepared, as it were, to do a comparative study across Japan and England. This is the data on who bullies whom, yellow for Japan, green for England. So you see that in Japan, almost all the bullying really is done in the same year group. In England, some of the bullying is done in the same year group, but more actually is done by higher years against lower years, often in the playground where an older age pupil might pick on a younger one. So here's clearly a difference in who bullies whom. But how do we interpret that sort of difference? Is this a difference in behavior, or is it a difference in the definition of bullying compared to ijime? Because obviously in Japan, people are asked about ijime. In England, people are asked about bullying. To explore this kind of aspect of differences between countries, I and colleagues have used a cartoon test, a stick figure cartoon test. This has been through several versions now. And you see an example of a stick figure cartoon there on the middle right. The caption is, "The rest of the team won't let Millie take part in a competition, even though she's one of the best players, because she's from a lower year group." And when you give this cartoon test, you show the cartoon with the caption, and you ask the pupils, is this an example of bullying, or is it ijime? In this particular country, looking at the table below, we asked, is it ijime in Japan? Is it wangta in South Korea? Is it bullying in England or in Canada? Ainelti in Iceland, Chefu in mainland China, Haiyan as Cantonese in Hong Kong, Gundapan in Pakistan, and Zorbalık in Turkey. These were terms most similar to bullying in a range of countries that participated. And below you see the percentages of pupils who said yes. So 29% of pupils say, yes, this is ijime, rather low really, compared to 81% who say in England this is bullying. And the other figures, as you can see, are rather higher too. So Japan is particularly low in saying that this kind of behavior is ijime. In other words, they're defining out this kind of exclusion of someone because they're in a lower year group. It's considered to be normative and not ijime, whereas in England, that's seen as being bullying substantially more. So when you think of those figures we found earlier, who bullies whom, is it the behavior that's different, or is it the definition that's different? That's a topic it's an issue that's difficult actually to disentangle. Another example, same study of Japan and England, where the bullying takes place. Again, yellow is Japan, green is England, and you see in Japan it's often the classroom. In England it's often the playground, as mentioned earlier. In the classroom, of course, there's more scope for this sort of social exclusion by other pupils. In the playground, there's more scope for bullying by older pupils who might be in the playground at the same time, which is the case usually in England. And then thinking about the weighting of different types. So we've talked a bit about social exclusion. This cartoon shows what might be a severe kind of social exclusion. The caption is, "No one wants to be with Julia for a paired activity." So in many countries, at the end of a lesson, pupils may pair off to tidy up, or they may pair off during the lesson for some kind of paired activity. And this poor person in the middle, Julia in this case, has been left out. So they're obviously feeling very socially excluded. What percentage of pupils think that is bullying or ijime or chefu or the other terms? Well, some do, but not that many, except in Japan and South Korea, where the great majority say, yes, this is ijime, yes, this is wangta in South Korea. So clearly they're very sensitive to these kinds of social exclusion and say that is e.g. male one car. Whereas in other countries, some see it as bullying, but it might just be, you know, they left out on this particular occasion and that's the way things go. The study I've just mentioned with Tomoyuki Kanetsuna, that's just one here in the Journal of School Violence. And as you can see, the ends are relatively small. We're talking about 100 pupils odd in each country and one school. So actually, this kind of study can give interesting suggestions about cross-national differences, but it's obviously not representative of the whole country. And here are a couple more examples of studies of Japan, USA, cross-national comparison, one college in each country, and cross-cultural differences in cyberbullying behavior. Larger numbers, but still not huge, really, and they don't say how many institutions that they carried the study out in. So these are examples of small-scale studies. But there are 5 much larger cross-national surveys which we can draw on if we're going to be looking in a broader way at cross-national or cross-cultural comparisons. And all 5 give data on many countries, and sample sizes are at least 1,000, if not, in many cases, quite a bit more. I already mentioned EU Kids Online at the beginning. Another survey is the Global School Health Survey, GSHS. Tends to be given to more developing countries. Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study. Although it's about mathematics and science, they do have a section on school climate, which has a question on bullying in it. Perhaps the most well-known one is Health Behaviour in School-Aged Children, HBSC, and also PISA, Programme for International Student Assessment, which in its latest survey also included pupil self-report data on being bullied. So all 5 of these large-scale surveys give victim rates, and in a couple of cases also bully rates, cross-nationally, and they all use pupil self-report data. So in that sense, rather comparable in the way they're designed. Just quickly, here's a page from the EU Kids Online survey, which gives examples of hurtful things. Has someone acted in this kind of hurtful way or nasty way to you in the past 12 months? And yes or no, and then how often it has happened. This is from GSHS. The next 2 questions are about bullying, and the definition of bullying is the obvious definition. On how many days were you bullied in the last 30 days, and in which ways were you bullied most often? Just notice here there's a range of different types of bullying, and a lot of them are verbal. I was made fun of because of my race, my religion, sexual jokes, how my body or face looks. TIMSS, during this year, how often have any of the following things happened to you at school? And again, a different range this time of different kinds of experience. HBSC, they give a definition of bullying, the obvious definition again, and then they ask, how often have you been bullied at school in the past couple of months? And 5 options there. And then PISA, during the past 12 months, how often did you have the following experiences at school? And a frequency range again, and different types of bullying here too. So we've got these 5 large cross-national surveys. Various studies have used them, but they've just used one of them, with one exception, which I'm not going to go into unless you ask me in questions. So for example, using HBSC, there's a couple of important studies here which have looked at cross-national differences in relation to socioeconomic inequality or income inequality. So they've taken the HBSC data for differences between different countries and correlated that with socioeconomic indices in those countries to arrive at some conclusions about the effects of income inequality, for example. A couple of studies here have used GSHS. Another study here has used TIMSS. So a number of studies have taken these surveys one at a time and taken the cross-national differences and related them to other aspects, such as income, such as family relationships, such as school characteristics, and so on. Now, there are issues in making these sorts of comparisons. And I'm going to return to the Guillaume and Funder chapter, which is in the book I mentioned near the beginning of the talk. And I think they give a nice summary of these sorts of measurement issues. And they talk about construct equivalence, structural equivalence, and measurement equivalence. So in other words, these are issues when we're going to compare what we're calling bullying in different countries, as those big surveys are doing. So first of all, construct equivalence. Does bullying happen in other cultures? Does it make sense to ask about bullying in other cultures? Well, I would say yes. And as I mentioned earlier, under similarities, I think any country you go to, once you explain what bullying is, people recognize that as a concept, and you can ask about it. Whether you use the term they use there, or whether you perhaps give a definition or some examples is another matter, but it happens in other cultures, so we can ask about it. The second one is structural equivalence. So what does bullying consist of? What types of bullying are you asking about? Remember, those different surveys often had a list of different kinds of behaviors, being made fun of in certain ways, being left out, so forth. So is bullying represented by the same types of behaviors in different cultures? Does it make sense to ask about these different types in different cultures? Again, I would say yes. I would say the similarities include that we can find all these kinds of bullying in any particular culture we go to. The third one, however, is more problematic. That's measurement equivalence. Are the factor loadings of equal strength? That means, are the loadings of the different kinds of bullying going to be equal, as it were, across different cultures? Do types of bullying vary in importance in different cultures? And there I think they do. And I think that was shown, for example, by the cartoon study result that we looked at when Julia was left out of the paired activity. We saw how that kind of social exclusion is seen much more often as ijime or wangta in Eastern cultures than it is as bullying in many Western or Middle Eastern cultures. So we might have a no there, and that's important because we'll come back to that when we compare different surveys, but different surveys have different numbers of items for different kinds of bullying. Another kind of measurement issue, even within one particular survey, are to do with bias in things like administration, response styles, translation, and reference group effects. So these are differences in perception or response of the participant rather than in the phenomenon itself. So, for example, imagine yourself as a pupil. You've been given this questionnaire, perhaps in class, or maybe individually, or in some big setting. What's the physical setting like? Is it on or offline? Is an experimenter around, as it were, looking over your shoulder? That might vary between different countries. The physical settings available might vary, and that might have an effect on how pupils respond. So what are, after all, quite sensitive kinds of questions. There may be response styles, such as socially desirable responding, where you tend to give answers that you think are sort of expected or socially desirable, or extreme responding, where participants tend to pick one or other end of the scale, perhaps. And again, these might vary between different countries. Translation issues is an obvious concern. And even if the term bullying or ijime or wangta or whatever is not used, there may be idioms, there may be familiarity with items as translated into different languages that might affect country comparisons. And finally, reference group effects. That refers to comparing yourself to norms of the culture you are in. What are the expectations of the culture you're in terms of that's being victimized? And do you see yourself as being particularly high or low in respect to those norms? So all these sorts of things might differ between cultures and might affect the kind of comparisons being made. But that's just within a survey. But now we come to the topic of comparing the larger surveys. There are 5 of these larger surveys, and they do overlap to some extent in the countries that they are picking up on. In fact, we found about 49 countries which have at least 2 different surveys that are including them. And together with colleagues in a couple of recent papers, we looked at this cross-national data on victim rates and to see how compatible, how much in agreement the larger surveys were. First of all, we looked for internal validity, which I'll explain in a moment. That's how consistent within a survey the findings are for cross-national differences. And then we compared the 5 surveys I've mentioned: UCO, GSHS, TIMSS, HBSC, and PISA, for for what we might call external validity. But just first of all, let's just look at internal validity. As I mentioned, 49 countries where they're being picked up by at least 2 of the surveys, often by 3 or 4. So quite a range of countries there from across the world, not just European and Western countries, but many other countries as well. So how internally valid are these surveys? Here we looked at across-country correlations from measures that were easily available. For example, some surveys give strict or lenient criteria for frequency. You can see what frequency cutoff they use, and perhaps there's two or three different cutoffs that are available. So are country differences the same for different kinds of criteria? If we take a strict criteria for frequency to count it as being bullied, or if we take a lenient criteria, do we still get the same ordering of countries in terms of prevalence? Or we can look across types of bullying. For example, in EU Kids Online, we can compare online and offline. We saw that data actually at the very beginning. We can compare ages. For example, HBSC gives data for 11, 13, and 15-year-olds. So are country differences the same for 11-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 15-year-olds? And we can compare genders. Again, HBSC and some of the other surveys give data for males and females. So are differences the same for males and females? So just a couple of examples out of a number we did. This looks at frequency criteria, and it's taking the TIMSS data, Trends in Mathematics and Science Survey. It has what we call a strict criterion for frequency and a lenient criterion for frequency, and another measure called scale score, which is a kind of particular combination of measures that they used in their reporting. And as you can see, all these, whether it's at grade 4 here or grade 8, all these correlations are really high, well over 0.9 in fact. So it doesn't really matter what kind of frequency criteria you're taking, the country differences are the same in TIMSS. Or the other example I'm going to show you is from HBSC, and it's across ages. So 11-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 15-year-olds. Here we're combining males and females. So the correlation of 11-year-olds and 13-year-olds, 0.92, 13-year-olds and 15, 0.92, 11 and 15, 0.83. 11 and 15 are larger age gaps, slightly lower correlation, but they're all still very high. In other words, the HBSC country differences are pretty much the same whether you're looking at 11-year-olds, 13-year-olds, or 15-year-olds. So in other words, all that, in fact, other data I haven't shown you, but it's in the article, all the surveys show high internal consistency, typically around R's of 0.9. So there's high internal validity. They're measuring something that's pretty consistent across countries, whether we're looking at boys or girls, younger pupils, older pupils, different kinds of frequency criteria. That's good. Very nice. What about external validity? And that was also the topic of what we were looking at in the couple of articles I mentioned. And this was triggered, my interest in this was triggered by initially seeing the high prevalence for Sweden found in the UKA, the EU Kids Online study, which I pointed out at the beginning of the webinar. As you may have seen there, Sweden was 4th highest out of 25 in EU Kids Online. That's at 13 years from HBSC. Actually, in UKA, sorry, but it's 3rd lowest in HBSC. So if we look at the HBSC data, Sweden is near the bottom. It's got low victim rates. If you look at EU Kids Online, it's got high victim rates, and really quite a big discrepancy between these two surveys. So what's going on? And that's not the only discrepancy, although it's perhaps the most marked one. If we look at Czech Republic, for example, it comes out high in EU Kids Online, 6th highest out of 25, but it comes out 4th lowest, 35th out of 38 in HBSC. So rather like Sweden, high in EU Kids Online, low in HBSC. Lithuania comes pretty much in the middle in EU Kids Online, but it's highest of all in HBSC. Portugal, as you may have remembered, the lowest in EU Kids Online, but the 10th highest in HBSC. So really big discrepancies here among some countries. Of course, some others, there's agreement. It's not totally a picture of different differences between these countries, but a number of discrepancies. So what's the actual correlation across countries between EU Kids Online and HBSC, or indeed the other surveys? So the first article we did, we looked at TIMSS, HBSC, EU Kids Online, and GSHS, where there were countries in common. And the correlations are rather modest. If we're looking at EU Kids Online versus HBSC, depending on whether we're looking at online bullying, offline bullying, which age, gender we're looking at, and so on, that's why there's a range of correlations. The range is 0.13 to 0.42, so pretty low correlations, really. And even some negative correlations coming out between EU Kids Online and TIMSS, which is pretty shocking. So a worry here that these surveys are not agreeing very well on which countries are high and which countries are low. PISA data came out in 2016, so then we included that as well in the second article that we published. And as you can see, again, we're getting rather moderate sorts of figures, although in one case we're getting up to 0.82 with PISA versus TIMSS for the most appropriate age range, which is quite good. I think we might have been hoping for correlations of 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, really, for external validity. If internal validity is 0.9, then I just thought external validity might have been 0.6, 0.7, 0.8. But it seems to be more often around about 0.3, 0.4, or even lower sometimes. So rather moderate agreement between different surveys on country differences. Well, how can we explain these discrepancies? What are the issues in comparing different surveys? And with my colleagues, Anki Gertzig and Suzanne Robertson in particular, we've looked at a range of differences between the surveys which might explain the rather modest agreement between them. So let's just look through these. The first one I put is definition of bullying. Two of the surveys give an obvious type definition of bullying. That's from HBSC and GSHS. The other three surveys don't give a definition of bullying as such. They rather give examples of behaviours, such as being made fun of in nasty ways, or being left out of the group, and so on. Sort of behavioural type of definition. So that's one kind of difference. What types of bullying are being assessed? Now, remembering what we talked about earlier in terms of weightings of different types across countries, and the sort of measurement equivalence that we and Thunder talked about, that's going to be very important. And when I showed you the sample questions from the 5 surveys, I made a point of saying these questions show different types of bullying, and some of them, they differ from each other. For example, GSHS has several questions on verbal bullying. Some other surveys don't have one question on verbal bullying. So the weighting of verbal bullying between surveys will differ. Similarly, the weighting of other kinds of bullying may differ between surveys. And that will affect countries, because countries vary in the weighting of these different kinds of bullying. So that's going to be a very important one. One or two surveys have different versions by age. They certainly differ in the frequency criteria and time reference period. The frequency scales are not always the same, and the time reference period is sometimes 30 days, it's sometimes 1 term, it's sometimes a year, and this might have some effect too. This is the single item or scale. What year was the survey given in? Was it a group survey or face-to-face? Most surveys are done in groups, apparently, but EU Kids Online used a face-to-face interview, which could make a difference, especially as sometimes it seems parents were within earshot of the interview going on. What are the sample characteristics? So ages, gender, national representation, use of the internet. For example, EU Kids Online only sampled pupils who were using the internet because they were particularly interested in that aspect of use of the internet. So that would have excluded probably a small proportion of young people who don't use the internet, but nevertheless, it's different from the other surveys which had no restriction on use of the internet. Non-response rates can be an important point, and certainly for GSHS, who published the non-response rates, these were sometimes quite high, like say 20% non-response rates in some cases, or even higher. And that obviously could affect the prevalence, especially if, for example, those pupils more involved in bullying others didn't respond, perhaps, because they were worried about perhaps being detected in some way. And then, obviously, linguistic issues and how the term bullying is translated for the two surveys that did use the term bullying, or indeed how other kind of idioms or words translated in the questionnaire. So there's a whole range of different issues here which could be in part responsible for discrepancies amongst the 5 surveys that we found. So some implications about this. I think firstly we need to be cautious about judging how countries appear in terms of high or low prevalence rates, especially if we're only relying on one survey. Obviously, if you're in Sweden and looked at the UCO survey, you'll be very worried that you're so high. Then the HBSC survey, you'll be claiming this is brilliant, we're really one of the lowest. Claims will be more convincing if 2 or even 3 surveys agreed on a country's relative position. So if you're coming out high or low in 2 or 3 surveys, then I think we can place more reliance on it. More research is needed into why there's a lack of high agreement amongst the surveys. I've given you some possible explanations. These need to be tested out more to see which of them might be, if any, might be the most responsible for the discrepancies that we find. Also, some recommendations for future surveys. TIMSS, GSHS, and PISA don't include, or don't obviously include, don't explicitly include online or cyberbullying, whereas HBSC and of course EU Kids Online did do this. GSHS and HBSC don't include examples of rumour spreading, although rumour spreading is one particular kind of bullying that is in the other surveys. It would be useful to have more details of non-response rates. It's only easily available for GSHS. And for GSHS and HBSC, how is the term bullying translated into different countries? These 2 surveys give a definition of bullying. We know they use the word bullying in the UK and Canada and the USA, English-speaking Ireland, but what term is used in other countries? We're not told typically what that term is, but it might be important to know. Finally, how might we explain cross-national differences insofar as we're confident about them? And we're sort of edging our way towards understanding at least some cross-national differences. Even if we're not too certain about prevalence rates, we do seem to be finding differences in some of the other characteristics of bullying, such as the weighting of different types, for example. Here I've found, and my colleagues too, we've found the EU Kids Online model to be an interesting one. Their model, which they use for looking at online behaviour, but can be generalised, I think, to looking at school bullying generally, looks at these 5 main factors. So cultural values, education system, technological infrastructure, regulatory framework, socioeconomic stratification. So to end up with, really, just briefly to look at these 5, cultural values, that would be, for example, things like individualism, collectivism, or power hierarchy. These are 2 examples taken from Hofstadter's work on cultural values. The education system, what sort of age levels characterize different schools? Is it grade retention? What kind of class groupings? The structure of the school day, supervision of break times, all these sorts of things might have an influence on the kinds and prevalence of school bullying. Technological infrastructure, particularly for cyberbullying, of course, what's the penetration of mobile phones, smartphones and the internet? Regulatory framework, are there school policies about bullying? Does there need to be? What legal aspects apply in a particular country? Are there laws about bullying or cyberbullying? And what sort of resources and anti-bullying initiatives are in place in the country? For example, in Sweden, we know how Kiva has been rolled out across most schools in Finland, actually, and that would be a major anti-bullying initiative that seems to be reducing the prevalence of victimization in that country. And in socioeconomic stratification, some of the earlier work I mentioned using HBSC data has suggested that socioeconomic inequality, as well as GDP, are predictors of levels of victimization. Here they found more victimization in countries with higher socioeconomic inequality. So we've got a range of different explanatory factors here, which in some cases have been looked at individually, but have not really been put together in a sort of multifactorial way to see which are most important for which kinds of differences and which kinds of countries. So to summarize, I would say a universalist position on bullying appears justified. There are important similarities, but also important differences across cultures, and we've seen some of those. A number of studies have made comparisons across cultures. Many of them are small scale, usually with small samples of pupils, also small samples of countries. So they're interesting, they can provide ideas, but for a broader perspective on this issue, we have to resort to the large-scale surveys, of which there are these 5 at least. And we found these are each internally valid. They're measuring something internally that's valid, but they show limited agreement on country differences where countries overlap between them. There are many issues around measurement and bias within a survey, and many other issues in comparing different surveys, which we need to know more about. When country differences are reasonably well substantiated, e.g. from different studies or surveys, then we need to try and understand them. And the 5-factor model from EU Kids Online provides one way of exploring such explanations. So, thanks to various colleagues who've helped me in this work, and I've provided a couple of extra readings here. One is the article we published comparing the 5 different large-scale surveys, and the second is a working paper looking particularly at the issues in comparing countries that I mentioned in the latter part of the talk. So I'll stop here and take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. If anyone has any questions at all, feel free to go ahead and put them in the question box in your GoToWebinar menu panel. And I'll wait just a few moments until we receive them. I do want to mention for those, if anyone is thinking of any questions or typing away, if you want to kind of jot down some of the resources that Dr. Smith just provided there on his last slide, that will be information that you can look into if you need further details. We won't be sharing the presentation from today. We will be sharing the recording, but not the actual PowerPoint. So if you'd like to have any of the information that was discussed today, it'd be best to check out the resources provided. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so you might be off the hook, Dr. Smith, from having to answer. Is there anything else at all that you wanted to say in closing here, or? Oh, wait, we do have one question. Hold on just one moment. Let me quick read it here. Okay, we have a few coming in now. That's great. All right. It says, have you considered how health behavior interventions can be used to manage and better understand bullying, such as avatars and educational videos? Could these be used as a cultural bridge to understand how to measure bullying more effectively?
Okay, I haven't looked particularly at health-based interventions, although obviously they could be important. I think for the purpose of this webinar, the interesting thing would be, are those kind of interventions developed in one country going to be applicable? Are they going to be transnational, or can you just transport them, as it were, to another country? And I would just say, be careful about that, because things can differ a great deal between countries in terms of what kinds of behaviours, health-related behaviours are considered sort of acceptable or normative and so on. And it would be important, I think, to pilot out anything like that in another country before you just transport it across.
Okay, thank you for that. And then also, this is a comment. It just says, this is a really interesting topic of discourse, and I believe it has opened my understanding to learn at cross-cultural variations of bullying in Africa. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for that.
We're beginning to see more research coming out of Africa recently, I think, which is nice, because until a few years ago, there wasn't very much, but I'm really seeing quite a few articles coming, so it's great to, I hope there are more coming soon.
Okay, it looks like that is it for questions for today. For those of you that are on the line, I will be sending a follow-up email tomorrow, just thanking you for your attendance, and we'll also include information on the recording of this webinar. Also, I just want to promote, Dr. Smith had in the beginning of his slides the logo for the World Anti-Bullying Forum, which is going to occur on June 4th through 6th in Dublin, Ireland. And there will be registration information in that follow-up email as well. I'm sorry, Dr. Smith, one more question just came through. I'll read this one. It's different cultural norms could be integrated into educational videos to use at schools in different countries. Do you think it's possible to measure these cross-culturally?
Gosh, that's a slightly complicated question. Do you mean educating pupils about different cultures and cultural differences? Is that what you meant? Can that person respond?
Let me see here. Felicia, are you able to respond to that, the question that Dr. Smith has back? She said no, integrated cultural norms and bullying educational videos.
I'm not quite sure what the person means, but obviously we've got to be aware of cultural differences both between cultures but also within cultures as well, especially in, well, I mean, I'm working in London, which is a very multicultural city really, so we can experience different cultural norms even just going to schools in London. And it obviously helps if pupils are aware, and teachers too, are aware of these different cultural norms for sure.
And then Felicia just responded and said, for each population to measure attitudes, knowledge, and practices surrounding bullying management and understanding. So
Sorry,
that looks like that might be a comment.
A comment, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Thank you for that, Felicia. All right, are there any other last-minute questions? And then we just have another comment. Thank you so much for the informative presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Smith. If you don't have anything further, I think we can go ahead and we'll end a tad bit early here and let everyone get back to their day. But I thank you so much for your time in presenting this. And I thank everyone for attending this webinar today as well.
Okay, that was a pleasure, and hope to see some of you in Dublin next year.
Yes, wonderful. I'll send further details on that tomorrow. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.